Welcome to one of our probably too infrequent webinars. My name is Graham Cook. I'm the MD of RSVP Design, and today we're going to look in a bit more detail than we would normally do at two of our products, Colourblind and Colourblind Plus. So these are a couple of verbal communication-based experiential learning activities, one of which has been around certainly for a long time, and the second certainly for at least a few years. And we tend to get lots of questions about these activities, and we thought we'd maybe hold this webinar today to try and give people a chance to learn a little bit more about them, and maybe to answer some of the frequently answered or the frequently asked questions that we get. Let's get started. So what I plan to cover today, and thank you also to everyone who pre-registered, because I know that we asked some questions, and the feedback to that was really useful in helping me decide what we were going to try and cover today. So one of the things that became obvious is that there are a number of people who have used Colourblind before and Colourblind Plus, but presumably still have some questions. But there are also a number of people who don't know either activity. So I'm going to try to cover both sets of questions today as we go through. So first of all, I'm going to have a look at what these activities actually are, what you would get if you have one of them, if you haven't seen them, how they might be combined, which is always a question that we get asked, or do you need both, or can you use either one, those sorts of questions. What kind of learning might you use them for? And again, that's a pretty open question, but we'll try to cover some of that, and then anything that we've missed out. So Colourblind, what is the background to Colourblind for those who don't know it? Well, probably the first thing to point out is that Colourblind has been around for a long time. My colleague, Dr. Jeff Cox, was asked to create an activity for training air traffic controllers back in the 1990s, in 1990. And at that point, Europe was expanding in terms of air traffic control, and they were looking to take people from a broad variety of backgrounds, not just those who had an interest in aviation. And what they said to Jeff is, we'd really like an activity that we can give to for basic training of air traffic controllers on day one when they turn up to be trained to be air traffic controllers. And the key learning focus was that we want these people to really understand what it's like and how difficult it is to create a shared and unequivocal meaning between people who don't share the same visual frame of reference. I'm sure for those of us who do a lot of flying, it's really comforting to know that the pilot in the air and the air traffic controller on the ground know absolutely what they're talking about, and absolutely share meaning when they're exchanging information. So that was Jeff's brief. He created an activity, which I'll show you in a second, called Colourblind. It was very successful. It's still in use, and he created a commercial version because I guess he had the brainwave that maybe just good communication skills weren't just for air traffic controllers, and other people may use them. So those of you who have been around Colourblind for a number of years might recognize that originally it was sold back in 1991 by a company called Pangyris, Jeff's first company creation. That's no longer around as a business. It was then sold by a company called Future Factory, and now it's solely distributed and created by RSVP Design. Jeff transferred the registration of that mark to when we created this business back in 2003. You'll find it available in distributors, but generally it's only sold by RSVP Design. And in fact, if you see anyone else using that name, we'd love to hear about it. So, if you buy a Colourblind, what do you get? What are the materials? There's a little picture of a blue box in the bottom right there, which comes from our website. But the physical materials are, first of all, there are 30 shapes that you'll get in a box made from a kind of Foamex lightweight plastic. So they're relatively light for carrying around, and hopefully if people are handling them, they don't have sharp edges and so on. And they're provided in 5 colours and in 6 different shapes. We provide 20 blindfolds because we ask people to be blindfolded when using Colourblind. Our ideal size for a group is probably about 14, so there are some extra blindfolds in there. Like most of our activities, we provide a full facilitator guide that will show you how to set it up, how to run it. And in fact, part of RSVP Design's criteria in creating these kind of tools is that we should be able to ship them out at a distance. You open the product never having seen it before, read the facilitator guide and be able to run it successfully. We don't like having reusable materials, and you can indeed wash these blindfolds if you want to, but of course you could provide your own replacements, or we do in fact provide replacement blindfolds if that's necessary. So that's the kind of physical materials. Probably of more interest to people, whether they've seen the activity or not, is how do you set it up? What is involved? And again, like many of our activities, the setup should be minimal. It should be relatively quick to set this up. And I'll go into a little bit more detail, but essentially the setup for this activity involves taking two pieces essentially at random from that total of 38, mixing up the remaining 28 pieces and handing those pieces out to people because they form part of the activity. And the way I tend to do it, as you can see from this picture here, is the first thing I do is ask people to get arranged in chairs. They don't need to be sitting at desks. They're going to be, tell them they're going to be handling some plastic pieces in their lap and then issue with them with their blindfolds. I find that if you ask people to put on the blindfolds first before you give them the brief, it's much more useful. And you can see this group has probably actually already started. They have some pieces in their hands. Now, again, what is interesting for me is often I speak to trainers who talk about having used Colourblind and maybe didn't go quite as well as they had planned, or something strange happened. And then I ask them about the brief. And often they haven't given the same brief as you will see on the page here. This is the brief that's suggested in the manual. I would strongly recommend that you don't deviate from it, because there's a lot of important information in here that is related to how the group goes about solving it. So the first thing is that we tell them there's a complete set of coloured plastic shapes. That's what we started with, and that's the 30 shapes. We take two pieces away from it, and then we're going to distribute the remainder of them amongst the group. So they will have a complete set minus 2. Your task is to identify the colour and the shape of the two pieces I've removed from that set. So for those of you who have never seen Colourblind, then that will be a very strange brief. For those of you who have seen Colourblind, you would probably expect to see some people behind their blindfolds with that kind of look on their face, or that kind of body language. How on earth are we going to identify the colour of a shape I have in my hand if I'm blindfolded? So the next piece of verbal information that you give to the group is, say, if you hold a piece up and say, what colour is this? I will tell you honestly and as many times as you need to check. I also suggest that they don't exchange pieces with other people, so that's quite important. Now, I know some facilitators who will only answer that question, what colour is it? Anything else the group answers, they tend to ignore them. I tend to be a bit more polite, so if they ask me something else like, well, how many pieces do we have, or is this a jigsaw puzzle, or any other kind of questions, I simply say, all the information you need will be contained within the group. Your job is to try and find that out. I also tend to say to them that I only will expect one answer, and when they give me their final answer, then the activity will be finished. I tend not to give them a time limit if I don't have one, and we'll talk about timing in a second. But that essentially are the materials and the brief for Colourblind. So that's exactly what happens. And then you will see your job as a facilitator is relatively simple, wandering around looking for particular behaviours or particular inputs from the group, and simply answering if someone holds up a piece and says, what colour is this, telling them what that colour might be. So a very simple exercise to run as a facilitator, very simple to set up, but typically reasonably challenging for most groups. So let's go back to numbers. A question we are always asked is, what happens if you don't have exactly 14 people? If you have exactly 14 people and you've got 28 pieces and they all get 2 pieces each, but what happens if you have 5 people or 20 people or 30 people? My suggestion is to aim to have each person having around 2 to 3 pieces in their hands at any one time. The reason for that is that if they only have one, they're likely not to be too engaged. If they have more than 3, that's a lot of pieces that can get dropped on the floor. Plus, they start to have a good proportion of what is possible in terms of the puzzle. If they only have 3 pieces, they'll only ever feel 3 of the 6 shapes that actually exist, and therefore have to rely on their colleagues to tell them what the other ones might be. And I'm always asked, because on our website it says technically you can work with a group of up to 28 people. And we kind of have to put that on, because if you have 28 pieces, then in theory you could have 28 people doing colourblind, each one with 1 piece. But I would suggest that if I opened up, how many people have we got? If I opened up the microphone to the 18 participants in this call and we all started talking, we would probably find it quite difficult to make sense of what's going on. And in my experience, having a group meeting with 20 or 28 people is really difficult. So unless that's what you wanted to do, I would probably not do that. If I had more than 14 people, my suggestion is to use the extra people as observers. Get them to look for whatever learning outcomes you're looking for. You can always have them stop halfway and join in the process and pull other people out as observers. And again, we can talk about how you might want to use observers as we go through the presentation today. Probably of more importance, and I would say that even experienced facilitators sometimes don't pick up on this. If you have a smaller group, say you only have 8 people, then I would consider taking out a whole colour. So, take out, instead of starting with 30 pieces, take out all the red pieces, and then you only have 24. You take out the 2 that they need to decide, the 2 pieces that they need to decide were taken out, and that only leaves you 22 to move amongst the 8 people. So again, they only have 2 or 3 pieces. So if you've got a smaller group, think carefully about how many pieces they will have in their hands. I have generally gone down to as small as 6 people. If you get down to 4 people, I don't think it's much of a challenge. So somewhere between, I would say, 6 and 14 is the ideal group size for Colourblind. So, as I say, I'm conscious that some people will have played Colourblind before, some will never have. So what I'd like you to do, particularly those that have never seen this exercise work, is to try to give you a very simple idea of the experience. So you can see a shape. This is a shape of one of the colourblind pieces. What I'd like you to do is imagine that you have that shape in your hand. You can close your eyes now that you've seen it, and try to describe to a colleague who would be sitting next to you with a blindfold on what that shape actually looks like. So if you can put into words, and maybe just type into the group chat here, how would you describe that shape to someone else who can't see it? Okay, let me hear some descriptions. And again, those of you who have used Colorblinds, feel free to put in any descriptions that you've heard people say if you remember what they've called this shape. So just type into the group chat, how would you describe this shape if you had it in your hands and you were trying to describe it to a colleague who is blindfolded and you're just trying to feel it. They tend to be, they're pretty much a 2-dimensional shape, pretty thin, so describe the 2 dimensions. Okay, an oblong with spikes is one suggestion. Any others? How would you describe this? Okay, a rectangle with a circular hole in the middle and has 2 triangles in the edges. I've heard it described like that. Give me another couple. A camera shape with a unicorn horn on 2 sides. Oh, I like that one. I like that one. Let me come back to that one later. A camera shaped with a unicorn horn on 2 sides. Excellent. I'll do like that. Okay. So how about this one then? How would you describe that shape? Give me some descriptions. Okay, pointed arrow with a hole in the middle. An arrowhead with a circular hole in the middle. Very precise, Sophie, thank you. Give me another one. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. I'm saying Nidia because that's what it looks like to me, but a fantastic description, a superhero mask with horns on one side. So I think it was an idea that had the unicorn ones as well. Okay, that's fine. And then final one, just give me some quick suggestions for how you describe that shape to someone who can't see it. Okay, a mountain with 3 peaks. Sophie? Mm-hmm. Give me another couple. Nadia, I was waiting to see what kind of animal we would have with horns on this one. Give me another one. Okay, a whale with the spear on its head with their mouth open. Yeah, these are fantastic descriptions. So what, just to give you a sense of this, so what we've done over, 2 or 3 minutes is that we've looked at 2 or 3 different shapes, and I've read out 2 or 3 descriptions. Now, the challenge in Colourblind is how do we move from those 2 or 3 descriptions to sharing a common understanding about what we have in our hands. Now, those of you who have never seen Colourblind done, who have never done it, might find this difficult to believe, but if I go back to the previous shape, I can work my computer here. Many times I've worked with groups, they would confuse this shape with the circular hole in the middle and triangles and rectangles with this shape, okay? It's the typical miscommunication that we see all the time in organizations that we would never see would be possible. And the wonderful thing about Colourblind is they're often replayed right in front of you. So when you're asking someone to describe to you something that they can maybe even see or feel very well, it's really quite difficult to do. Okay, so the first thing, having seen some of the challenges, again, for those of you who don't know the activity, I guess the question is, well, how does Colourblind typically progress? And from an RSVP point of view, it's really important that we're able to tell you how it will progress, because we think predictability in choosing and using these types of activities is really important. The first thing, fairly obviously, is it will depend a little bit on the group size and ability. What we've found over the years is that generally younger teams, particularly intact teams who are prepared and maybe even have a desire to listen to each other and consider ideas and trying out things, will move quickly to a solution. So it actually rewards good teamwork. It rewards teams that are full of different types of characters, who are prepared to tolerate that diversity, who are happy to see leadership move around the group. Those types of groups will do Colourblind pretty well and pretty quickly. On the other hand, again, maybe those of you who have worked with senior groups can tell me whether you agree, but any time I've run it with senior teams, I've found they quite often struggle, partly because they often equate talking with power. So the person who has the most power, wants to do the most talking, a bit like me right now, I guess. And somehow, if you're not contributing by talking, you're listening, that kind of reflects on your lack of ability, lack of knowledge, and it's a thing we see a lot with senior people. However, in general, most groups will achieve this between 50 to 30 minutes. So if you're trying to plan a Colourblind session, I would allow around 30 minutes for the activity and then whatever time you need for the debrief. Those who will do it in 15 minutes will have lots of repetition of good communication processes. They'll adapt it to the listener. They'll listen carefully and reflect back the type of language that they hear. They'll check for understanding. And there will be a good team problem-solving process. I had a facilitator once who had told me that they always told people how many pieces they would have. Now, a good problem-solving process would be, how can we find out what we already know? And it's pretty easy to find out how many pieces you have by asking the people in your group to count them. So I would never tell them how many pieces they have. I would expect them to be able to figure that out for themselves. And yeah, some groups will fail. Again, I tend not to provide an answer because it's not important to me that they can do colourblind or even they can do it in 15 minutes or 45 minutes. It's more important that they can learn what some of the useful team-solving problem processes are, good communication processes. But I may step in and help a group if they're really way off the mark and unlikely to be successful. But it would typically be coaching support rather than directive to say do this and don't do that. So again, something worth considering if you're trying to help a group learn something inside the activity. There's nothing wrong with trying that. So that's colourblind. I'm going to leave that to one side. I know we spent a fair bit of time on it, but I'm conscious there are some people who don't know the activity well. So what is Colourblind Plus? Why do we have Colourblind Plus? Where did it come from? Well, by the time 2012 came around, some consultants had been using Colourblind for about 20 years and had really been bending my ear, but more importantly, my colleague Jeff Cox's ear, and saying, you know, can you create another version? We really love using Colourblind, but to be honest, we've been using it so long, we're kind of fed up. And to be honest, we didn't, and Jeff didn't really respond to the consultants being fed up because every group that comes to it is going to be new. What he was more interested, I guess, was responding to how do I create some new learning from this process that I've created. So what he did was he watched how groups and thought about how groups had approached solving colourblind over the last 20 years and noticed some things. In general, as I mentioned earlier, groups can often easily mistake one shape for another. I know you wouldn't believe that by looking at it, but believe me, and if you have the chance to do it, you'll see that that's true. Success can come quickly. Some groups can be really lucky because what you tend to do is try to work out the shape that's missing. So sometimes they get one in the first two and don't bother checking the last four. But they can make lots of assumptions that if they don't check them can cause a problem. Even if you have some experience of the activity, it's difficult to transfer that knowledge to others. And what I mean by that, if you have a group and find out, oh my goodness, of the 14 people coming to work in Colourblind today, I know 5 have done it before, I would say don't panic. Absolutely put them into the activity because how they are able to transfer that knowledge would be really interesting to observe. And I would suggest it often makes it more hard and more difficult for groups having someone who says, you know, this is definitely the bow tie or this is definitely the cloud. And as I say, giving the shapes a name is a good tactic, so people tend to agree on a common name within a group. So let me describe what you get in Colourblind Plus. You might notice the little box on the bottom right, again, this time shows a red box. However, again, it shows 30 shapes and 5 coloured sets of 6 shapes, 20 blindfolds and a full facilitator guide. So having just had the experience that we had in Colourblind, looking at that description, you would say, well, what is different about it? If I give you the brief that's written in Colourblind Plus is as is written here, and it's exactly the same as the verbal brief for Colourblind. So again, what you might ask is different about it. So here's one of the things that's different. So this is one of the shapes. Can you try again? Just give me, you know, 1 or 2 suggestions for how you might describe this shape this time. This is a Colourblind Plus shape as opposed to a colourblind shape. How would you describe that to someone wearing a blindfold that lets them know what you have in your hands? Any suggestions? A Pueblo house. Thank you, Nadia. You're well in there. I have to say, my view of a Pueblo house, and I have the advantage of looking at this shape, is that I don't get that, but there you go. That's a challenge. What about this one? Someone else give me a shape for this one. How would you describe that to someone? Okay, the last one, I think, Sarah came in, I just saw that, a square with pieces bitten off in 3 corners. Yep, I saw edge. Yep, I can see those if I had that in my hand. One more. So this is another shape. Sarah, would that last description you gave me, a square with pieces bitten off 3 corners, still work for this shape? A chimney, Christina? Okay, I get that. Tractor. Any others? Okay. A jigsaw piece. Okay, so quite general shapes there. How difficult do you think this would be in comparison to the last shapes to help people understand what you have in your hands? Just the same, more difficult, less difficult? Any thoughts these three have? Okay. Sophie thinks it's harder. Christina thinks it's more difficult. Okay, absolutely, and that's certainly part of the design. So the shapes are more difficult to describe and name. Okay, so exactly the same brief, exactly the same task. Identify the colour and the shape of the two missing pieces. But we've made it more difficult because the shapes are more difficult to describe and name. They're also less distinct from each other, and I'll show you that visually just in a second. More effort is required to describe the two shapes that have been removed. Yeah, so the whole task involves a little bit of extra difficulty. And this is where I guess Jeff had a bit of a nod to those consultants who wanted to set a more challenging task than the Colourblind they'd been using. So if you had come in having done Colourblind previously, maybe on the last program or last year, you're given a blindfold, you're told that same brief, you might be tempted to make some assumptions about Colourblind Plus. And in businesses and in the world today we live on, where there's constant change and we're asking people to be aware of constant change, that might be the only reason that you would introduce Colourblind Plus to a group who has done Colourblind, just to watch to see how tempted they are to fall into easy patterns of behaviour and easy patterns of communication, and then what the reaction is when they find that the landscape is a little bit different. So at that point we thought we had Colourblind Plus finished, but then my colleague Anne, one of our other directors, noticed something about these new shapes that Jeff had produced in this new activity. And what she decided was that there were some other ways to use these same materials. So can I ask you, what do you notice now if I put all 6 shapes on the screen? What do you notice about, and this is the full set of 6 different shapes that are in Colourblind Plus. What are some of the characteristics you notice when you see them laid out together side by side? Okay, you would easily mislead mislead yourself maybe and others on the shape description. Yep, absolutely. So although when you look at them, yes, you can see there's 6 distinct shapes that are they're really 3 pairs that are really quite similar, and that was one of the criteria between Colourblind Plus. So absolutely, Christina, it forces people to be very specific about the nuances of this shape. So it's not sufficient to say, well, I think it's a factory or I think it's a saw with three shapes. I did this in Poland a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting to watch the frustration when people were trying to agree on a name for these shapes and what that shape might actually look like. So how does this help? You know, how does this help in terms of saying there are other ways to use the materials? Because clearly, if you throw a group straight into Colourblind Plus, this is going to be a really challenging communications activity. So the first thing we thought is this gives you a chance to actually start off with a much simpler exercise. And what we suggest in the manual is take 6 of the shapes, and you can see them here. You can see you have a set of 3 blue and a 3 grey. So we set up a set of pairs. We give the blue shapes to one person, we give the grey shapes to the other. We sit them back to back and say to them, what I want you to do is identify the odd one out in the 3 shapes that you have. So only by verbal discussion with your partner who's seated behind you can you identify the shape that doesn't have an exact match. Okay. Now it's a 5-minute activity, but immediately starts to get people into this idea of precise language. And for those of you who think that that's a really easy thing to do, hopefully you can see the concentration on the faces of this pair of people doing it. It's actually quite a challenge even in 5 minutes. But within 5 minutes activity, you've already built this idea about how do we share a common language, how do we absolutely identify that we're talking about the same thing when we don't share the same visual frame of reference. And then decided, well, you could then lead on from that first introductory 5-minute activity, take a bit of learning, and then ask people to apply it in the next activity. And that's really the cornerstone of experiential learning. How do you get people to change behaviour? How do you give them an opportunity to use some learning that they've just been provided with, whether it's theoretical learning in the way of new knowledge, or whether it's a practical application like they've just experienced in that. So what we do this time is we bring two pairs together, we give them a blindfold, and then again we say do the same thing. This time you've got 12 shapes between 4 of you. You might have randomly been handed a shape that you'd felt before, so you might already have given that a name with your partner. Now you've got another 2 people to deal with in the group. How do you find the 2 shapes that don't match from the 12 that you have? And this then makes it an order of magnitude more difficult. You're going from maybe a 5-minute activity to something like a 15-minute activity. And potentially once they've done that, they would be ready for the full Colourblind Plus challenge. So I would say that typically when you get a group doing Colourblind Plus, you should maybe allow 20 to 45 minutes to do this, because it is going to involve that extra level of checking and detail that you wouldn't normally find in Colourblind. So it's kind of confusing to explain how Colourblind Plus is both easier than Colourblind and more difficult, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what we mean by that in terms of using the materials. Okay, again, please just let me know if I'm leaving you with unanswered questions. Send them through to Laura and we can pick them up. So that's a little bit about the physical materials, how each activity was developed, how it stands around. Christina's just asked me about how I describe the second step of bringing the 2 pairs together. I'll just go quickly to tell you on that. So what we do is that you can see the 4 people there. So one pair has been working with 6 shapes. Another pair has been working with 6 entirely different shapes. Bring both of those pairs together. We mix and match the 12 shapes in a certain way. And this time they have to find, again, 2 that don't match. So this time they're going to have 5 pairs and 1 that doesn't match. Okay. So how might we combine them? Because again, if you have both activities, you might decide, well, how could I use them together? The first thing I would say is that is entirely dependent on what your learning design objectives are. So I can't really answer that for you. You have to decide what is important about what I want this group to achieve. What is the behavior I want to change in this group? What is the skill I want to build? And what's the best way of doing it? But here are some features you may want to think about. So Colourblind Plus, as I mentioned, you can allow about 5 minutes to do that. It really starts to get people into this mindset of being very precise about their descriptions, about their instructions, about how they work together. One of the big jumps in going from a paired version to the small group of 4, apart from it taking a bit more time, it really highlights how much more difficult it is to have a shared meaning between 4 people than it is a shared meaning amongst 2. When you move from the 2s to the pairs, both pairs will already have called the same shape something else. You have to exchange all that jargon information, and it just sets the group challenge that much more difficult. So if you're looking at any kind of aspect of moving from small group, maybe even individual working, to small team working, maybe just doing these 2 activities gives you 20 minutes of really useful behavioural information to work with. Next, longest and next most difficult is running the full Colourblind activity. As I say, it's about developing common language, problem solving, maybe up to half an hour. And then the final, in terms of the most highest degree of difficulty and longest time, is Colourblind Plus. Lots of potential for assumptions going wrong, lots of requirement for repetition, precise communication required, and really strong problem-solving processes, because usually the group, the method they start off with won't work. They have to go back and revisit how do they do this. I would also say generally technical teams and intact teams will do Colourblind pretty easily. They will begin to struggle a little bit, any kind of team doing Colourblind Plus, if they're given it cold. So what else might you do about combining them? Well, again, once you know your objectives, part of those design objectives might be considerations of the actual group. Has either been exposed to the group been exposed to either activity? If they've done Colourblind, is this a chance to allow them to be caught in the act of making assumptions? How much time do you have? If you really only have 20, 30 minutes, there's no point in trying to run a Colourblind Plus. This idea of valuing the idea of building on learning acquired and putting it into practice. For some groups, they really need to, and you will know this based on your own understanding of those learning groups, they really need the idea to put something into practice. Often senior people will intellectually understand that they need to do some of these things for good communication, and maybe setting up a couple of directors to fail on a 5-minute activity on the back-to-back paired activity might just allow them to actually change their behaviour when they go into the Colourblind Plus or the full Colourblind. And then secondly, what success do you predict? Are you happy that the group might fail? There's a lot of learning can come in failure, or do you really want the group to be successful and therefore choosing an activity that fits with their level might work? So again, you could combine those, and going back, if you have both, you don't need to do them order. I have run Colourblind Plus, then gone straight into Colourblind. I've done Colourblind Plus small group and then gone into the large group. So generally how you combine them is entirely up to you. Okay, so we're about 2/3 of the way through, and I just wanted to move on a little bit again, maybe for those who haven't used Colourblind and are wondering, well, what else might I use this for, and what type of learning could I get out of using this type of activity? The first thing I would say is that there's lots of learning will come out, and it really requires you as a facilitator, I think, to focus what is relevant to your learning objectives. If you want a group for 20, 30 minutes doing either version of Colourblind, you'll see lots of things about leadership. You'll see lots of things about personal contributions to teams. You'll see lots of things that will give you clues to people's personality. You will see a whole range of things. So what is important is for you to decide, what am I using this activity for? Is it to give the group an opportunity to learn from each other as a team? Is it an opportunity to see where the real leadership is in this group? What might it be, and then pick it out from there. Those of you who are maybe only seen Colourblind from our website will see that we tend to indicate a maximum of 6 learning areas for every product that we produce. It doesn't mean that there's only 6, and in fact in Colourblind's case there could be a lot more. But here are the 6 kind of top areas we would say. If you're looking at collaboration, for example, Colourblind is a great exercise. You can't complete Colourblind unless everyone participates. If you're holding a couple of pieces in your hands and don't contribute what you've got, the team won't work. So it's a great way of getting everyone to collaborate is working on Colourblind. The effective communication and probably the knowledge management is pretty obvious. So if you've had someone who has done Colourblind before, maybe even a few people in the group, bring them in and see how effectively they can transfer that knowledge. You do have to listen. If you have people who only want to talk, then this will be a real challenge for them. And in fact, it was my first introduction to experiential learning, some 30 years ago, when one of the sales team in our business finally understood the difference between talking and listening. And it was only through doing this exercise that the penny really dropped for that person. Classic problem-solving strategies are required, and obviously it gives people just a chance to work on an unfamiliar problem together that's really quite challenging. The only 2 differences we've put for Colourblind, arguably you can use Colourblind Plus for all of the same things that you use Colourblind for, is we've introduced the idea of change management. So this idea of people who have done an activity before, okay, we're doing the same one. Well, no, how do you react to that kind of change? What is the reaction when people say, well, hold on, this doesn't seem right. Last time I did it, it was very obvious what the 6 different shapes were. And then the other thing you'll see down there is resilience. Resilience is one of those topics, I think, that's common across many organizations. For some, it means stress and coping with pressure of difficult tasks. That's certainly true in Colourblind Plus. Watching individuals as they get really frustrated in Colourblind Plus, what is their personal reaction for it? You might use this as an opening to a resilience workshop and look at using the evidence that you had coming out from Colourblind Plus. You don't even need to run at the end. Do 20 minutes of it and then look at, what resilience was required in order to keep going and what is required to be successful. So those are some suggestions from us on the website in terms of learning areas. The other thing I would say is have a look at the facilitator guide that comes with it. Every guide that we provide has some suggestions on areas. So here's one of the parts of communications, managing information. Here's some classic questions that you might ask the group to help them to unpack the learning that came from using Colourblind, or indeed Colourblind Plus. What else? Well, if in doubt, ask us. We love getting questions. We love hearing about your learning design problems. We love hearing about the challenges that unreasonable line managers and clients give you. That's how we come up with ideas for new products and how to use them. So by all means, drop us an email, pick up the phone, talk to us. We would love to hear more, particularly when you've been successful in using them. Create some case studies. There's a case study you'll find on the website about Colourblind from a client who had just that. We had a long discussion, gave them suggestions about how to run it, and then it worked well. I think Laura has put that link on the chat if you need. Okay, so that's a bit about how you might extract learning. I'm going to jump back to the background because I didn't want to kind of take it out of order, but we haven't let Colourblind just lie. In fact, this year we've been working on an app that we're due to launch probably next month. I'd hoped it would have been launched by now, but we've had a couple of delays. The testing and everything has gone well. And it's an app that we hope will allow facilitators to focus on individual contributions during a Colourblind session. And this actually came from, maybe a good 5 or 10 years ago, talking to a customer of ours, the Center for Creative Leadership in the US, one of the big business schools. And they regularly would video the entire session of a Colourblind set and use that video, play it back for people in a one-to-one coaching session to help them review their performance. And we thought it would be really good to do that. But of course, that doubles the amount of time that you have if you've got to watch the whole video, and then you need technology and editing and so on. So we decided to create an app that we thought could do some of that. And what we will do, and I'll show you in a second what it looks like, but the idea is that every time someone would order a Colourblind, they'll get an access to the app. Initially, it'll just be available from the App Store for use on iPads, but hopefully if we get feedback from people they find it useful, we'll look to make it available for Android tablets as well. And as I say, more details will follow soon. So anyone who's interested in this specifically and wants to get some advanced information, do drop us an email. So I'm going to try and switch this video on. It's a little video that will be used as part of the help screens, and I'll try not to talk over it because I think you'll probably want to hear the video, but I'll stop it in a second just to explain what's going on. So this would be the screen you would see on your iPad. Okay, so hopefully you could get a sense of what's going on here. So what we have, just to explain very, very briefly and very quickly, is that what you would do, first of all, is set out the people on your iPad screen the way they're set out in the room. So just take a photo of them, give them a name. So you have individuals, and then you also have a group, because sometimes people will make a contribution specifically to someone, and you may have heard that in the video. Other times it's a general comment thrown out to the group. And the coding on the left-hand side are the types of inputs that people may give during Colourblind. And what this app does is allows you to very quickly in real time tap on the person, the contribution, who it was made to. So at the end of the session, maybe after 20 minutes, you've got a report that you can play back, speed it up, or give it to individuals that show the types of contributions that people have made. And we think this would be a useful addition for people using Colourblind. And again, if you're interested in it, please let me know, and we'll get you an evaluation copy or get details to you when we can. Okay, so again, sometimes a bit of a confusion over what is available in terms of the products. So you can buy the products individually. Those of you who haven't been to our shop, Colourblind can be bought on its own, Colourblind Plus can be bought on its own, and what we call the package is the two versions together. So there's a bit of a discount in buying both together, and hopefully the earlier explanation will let you understand that you may want to mix and match both types depending on the type of challenges that you have. And thanks for your time and attention. Hopefully we will give you a chance to see some of our other products. And if you've got any questions on Colourblind or anything else, please do let us know. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.